I really don't know about this. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2019 A24 psychological horror film, Saint Maud. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all that extra content. Saint Maud stars Morfydd Clark, Jennifer Ehle, and Lily Knight, and was directed by Rose Glass in her directorial debut. It tells the story of the ultra-religious hospice nurse, Maud, played by Morfydd Clark, as she becomes more and more obsessed with saving the soul of her patient. So I gotta say that I'm very excited to finally talk about this movie, because it was a bit of a first for me. You might be looking at the release date of this film and today's date and noticing a bit of a discrepancy there, and that's because Saint Maud was actually the first film I ever got a screener for, all the way back at the beginning of July. So I want to give a very delayed thank you to A24 and the Cinemania World podcast for that screener. I went into Saint Maud completely blind. I knew it was an A24 horror film, but that's about it. I didn't watch the trailer, I didn't read any festival reviews, I didn't even look up the basic premise, but just the fact that I knew this was an A24 film prepared me for it. Or at least as prepared as one can get for a movie like this. If you've seen any of my other A24 reviews, you know I have a very complicated relationship with their films, especially the horror movies. Sometimes I really connect with them and love them, but it's definitely far more often the case that I find them a bit underwhelming and difficult to appreciate beyond a technical level. A24 films are weird. There's really no other way to put it. They're weird and usually pretty artsy and typically don't explain all that much. And Saint Maud is most definitely an A24 film. As expected, this movie is pretty fantastic from a technical standpoint. Much like The Lighthouse last year, the first thing that really jumped out to me here was the sound design. Before we even begin to get a sense of what's happening in this movie, the sound does a great job of establishing the atmosphere. It's this interesting blend of unsettling, but also very controlled and intentional, which actually mirrors the character of Maud really well, immersing us in her world before we even realize it. Every drip of water, or long cigarette drag, or crunch of a shoe cuts through in a very precise way that's impossible to ignore. The visuals are equally impressive. Good cinematography has become a bit of a staple for A24 released movies, and while I don't think this is at the visual level of a film like Midsummer, for instance, it still stands out to me in an impressive way. The majority of the story is set in fairly mundane locations, like a rundown apartment or the interior of a nondescript house, and uses a color palette of mostly browns and whites, so it was never going to have that immediate standout wow look to it. There are certainly a few very striking shots in this movie, though, usually accompanied by a bit more color. But even the more standard shots are wonderful to look at, with some really good framing and also some off-kilter camera angles, which once again do a good job of providing us with some insight into the psyche of our main character. So, with all of the technical excellence on display here and A24's track record, it begs the question, is Saint Maud a case of style over substance? And the answer to that is sorta. This movie does have a plot and an actual main character, so it's not just pure style, but it's not exactly presented in a very typical way. Now, that's not to say that there's a non-linear timeline or any gimmicky structure thing going on. It's just very esoteric. We're given the slightest hints of information about Maud and her past, and the movie's set up in a way that feels a bit like a psychological thriller mystery. We get this buildup of tension and suspense that seems like it's leading to some answers or an explanatory reveal, but we just end up with more questions. I gotta say that usually movies that present their story like this frustrate me. I don't need an explanation for everything in a movie, and I certainly don't need for every little thing to be explicitly explained, but I do like for movies to have at least an intended interpretation. I mean, sometimes it's fun to think about and discuss all the little meanings and unexplained possibilities, but movies that are thematically open-ended usually leave me pretty unsatisfied. And so I'm torn on this movie in that regard, because it is thematically dramatically open-ended, and very few questions are answered. But at the same time, it leaves open for what I see as three possible explanations for the events of the film, one of which I think is incredibly interesting, the other two less so. Since this is a spoiler-free review, I'm not going to go into these explanations any more than that, but not knowing which of the three was actually the director's intended interpretation just makes it very frustrating for me. That being said, the arcaneness of it all wasn't a deal breaker for me, and I'm sure a lot of people will really like how open to interpretation it is. Whichever way it was intended, it's definitely an interesting examination of religious fanaticism and the sometimes imperceivable line between real and imagined. This film's structured like a slow burn, but with an incredibly short 83-minute runtime, it doesn't really overstay its welcome. While I wouldn't personally call this a horror movie in the classic sense, it's certainly an unsettling and tense experience that leaves you with a final image that'll be burned into your brain for quite some time. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number one has definitely got to be the technical aspects. Even though there were some disturbing images and sounds, this movie still manages to be a joy to watch and listen to. Both the visuals and the sounds are crafted in a way to match the precise but off-kilter nature of Maud, which really enhances the atmosphere of the film. The sound design especially stood out to me for this reason, and there were a few moments of particularly visceral sounds that made me cringe in pain. The second pro is how suspenseful this film is. On paper, this doesn't exactly sound like a very tense movie, but with the mystery surrounding Maud's past and her current state, it really is. She's a very strange character who feels a bit off in a way that you can't quite figure out. And even though we really don't end up with many answers or much of an explanation for the things set up throughout this film, the build-up is undeniably suspenseful, because you're just waiting for the moment when things are inevitably gonna get crazy. It is an A24 movie after all. On the con side, this movie's just too esoteric. It's what I've come to expect from A24 horror films, so it definitely wasn't a surprise, and I can't really say that I was disappointed by it either, because I expected it. It's just not what I was hoping for once the story started to really get established. It seemed like it was heading in a particular direction, but then the rug kind of gets pulled out from under us. And I wouldn't have minded if the floor that we fell on as a result had a different but equally clear direction. But instead, it just opens up too many possibilities with too few explanations. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Saint Maud or any of the films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Saint Maud 3.5 out of 5 paws. I gotta say, I had a hard time deciding how I really felt about this one. It was a frustrating watch for me, as many A24 films are, but at the same time, it really stuck with me. So after thinking on it for a while, I decided to go a bit higher than my initial gut reaction. I would recommend Saint Maud to fans of A24 films, especially their horror output. I know that probably sounds like the most generic and obvious recommendation in the world, but it's the most fitting. Saint Maud is classic A24. It's a beautifully crafted movie, but it's incredibly weird, never exceptionally scary, and very, very enigmatic. If you want an artsy, thoughtful, horror-ish movie, you'll probably really like it. If not, this is likely going to be a disappointing WTF kind of movie for you. If you liked Saint Maud, I would recommend First Reformed for another religion-centric A24 movie that goes in some very unexpected directions and has a few instances of startling imagery. If you want another very esoteric movie that's similar to the first act of this film before the genre shift, then you might want to watch Persona for its strange psychological nurse-patient relationship. And if you want another technically marvelous but frustratingly open to interpretation A24 film, then you should definitely watch The Lighthouse. It's a very different type of story, but it's another one whose sound design blew me away. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Saint Maud? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what movie has the most shocking final image? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insider information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.